legislation landed because the European Commission realized a few years ago now, I think I can say that, that cyber threat is a real thing because modern life is centered around digital connected infrastructure. So literally almost every piece of people's lives can be harmed by someone through the network. Cybersecurity is something that really became the focal point when it comes to legislations, and open source got dragged into this, so to say, because I think the numbers are around 80% of all software solutions depending on and containing open source software. So there's literally no way around it. If you're touching a phone, a computer, there is open source code somewhere so that those devices can provide the functions that you're using. Now, when it comes to cybersecurity and how the Commission is approaching this space, what they are trying to do is they are trying to regulate the space to make sure that companies and commercial organizations, when they are creating a product and a solution, they are, as manufacturers, liable for that product and any consequences, like if any harm is made to any human being who is using that product. Now, when it comes to open source software, like who is the manufacturer? So is the European Commission going after volunteers and hobbyists who are working on open source code? In the latest evolutions of the CRA, they are mostly not, since there are stewards to open source software and open source projects. You can think of open source nonprofit foundations, and technically a company can be a steward of an open source project as well. However, that title and role only goes if they don't have commercial interest and commercial product depending on that software, because if they do, then it's a whole different story. So far, this is where the CRA has landed, but when it comes to compliance to it, there's still a lot of standardization type efforts that need to happen. So in order to the whole thing to move to action, there are still a lot of things that have to happen. There is a warning sign up there though. If you look into the dates, companies needing to report on and show some type of compliance, and the deadline for that, when that starts and when the standardization efforts are supposed to be done, some of the dates are pretty close. So if you're with a company who is producing software products, solutions, services relying on open source, this is something that you not just have to keep a close eye on, but also have to prepare how you are going to be compliant to the CRA and related standards. And it's not just for Europeans, even though I talked about the European Commission. So this is the really short rundown of what's coming down the pipe. Phil, let me know what I left out, because it's a lot.
I think you touched upon it well. I guess maybe to give a little more specifics on how things move from the intent of the CRA to the compliance piece and what the standards bodies are doing. One of the areas that I'm familiar with is there's a requirement to notify an open source project if a manufacturer or somebody using that software in a commercial product has found some kind of bug or vulnerability associated with that software. this is a new wrinkle on the relationship between users and projects, in the sense that well, the manufacturer must identify and provide a fix to the upstream if they've created a fix that's going to their downstream users. But that fix doesn't necessarily need to be taken, and often isn't on first blush, when a user, particularly a new user to a community, tries to submit a new feature or a new bug fix. So the relationship between how that gets documented, was the obligation of compliance fulfilled when that fix was provided? Is there a common place that they can notify a project so that they can register that indeed, yes, we have, and we have documented proof that we've done this, right? So there are all of these nitty gritty nuances now that each little aspect of the CRA and the intent of it is now coming to very specific sets of requirements. And how do you actually solve that? What new processes do you put in place, be it in the manufacturers and those users of open source, and in what needs to be in the projects, so that indeed that documentation does happen? So that's the level, I think, where we are. And there's plenty of questions and plenty of gaps that exist that need to be figured out in this period of time. So again, I continue to think that the idea behind the CRA and having some level of standards and regulations, given the breadth of open source across the commercial ecosystem, and particularly across all of the critical infrastructure that exists around the world, it's important to have these kind of baselines that we work off of. But yeah, getting there is it's a slow process. And as you mentioned, I think when the process started with the European Commission, there was a lot of misunderstanding about how open source works. What are the relationships? And I think even still, there is confusion, and that will slowly continue to work out. We have cases where commercial entities are using a piece of open source. They're significantly contributing to that open source. They're putting in their commercial product, but they're also doing prototypes with that software in a next evolution with universities as to how that might be used. Well, is that now up to the same security standard as a proof of concept as what's in the commercial product? So, making sure that we're very clear on what is open source, what is meant for commercial use, and what isn't, and whose responsibility it is ultimately to secure that software. These are the things that, like I said, as we go from the intent phase to the specific compliance phase, clarity is sought and is being exposed by everybody.
Personally, I like this effect of the CRA, because if you look into the commercial space, like you mentioned, that there are the companies who are using the software, the open source project, and they are participating, contributing back, submitting the bug fixes, not even just the bug report. Maybe they will also they are also doing the bug fixes themselves. This is great, but there are a lot of companies who are just taking the code, hey, it's free, and then they do whatever maintenance they do in-house, and then that's it. And I think very often they are getting labeled with the name freeloaders, and it's not a nice term, but I think it sometimes you have to use it. But on the other hand, I also want to clarify that when the license allows individuals or companies to take the software and do whatever they want with it, like from license perspective, they are not doing anything wrong.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
However, when it comes to, again, the ecosystem and the sustainability of this ecosystem and the economy that sits on top of it, now that is a whole different question. If you think about, base infrastructure like operating system, and even to the level of like cloud software, virtualization, containers, like everybody depends on those pieces. And if everybody in the commercial space would be a freeloader, then these will just crumble. And if that infrastructure crumbles, then everybody will suffer. And, not just those companies, but every single user that they have. So if the idea of you can do maintenance upstream and still have enough control over the process to be able to do your product development workflow mostly as you used to, if by itself this sentence doesn't fly, then I'm happy that we do have something like the CRA that will make companies think about how to do this, and how to contribute to, and well, let's use the word, how to invest in maintaining critical infrastructure. It's like if our taxes didn't go to fix up roads. Most developed countries would have a really hard life if that was the case. So we should look into doing the same with open source software. However, there's one thing that I think we touched on a couple of times at least on the podcast as well, is that the 80% number of like depending on open source code also means that once somebody brought one open source component in, that will drag a lot of dependencies into that product and solution with itself. And now, is that core company responsible for all those dependencies now? Because that's when the effort can end up being much higher than the return on the
Become
product side.
overwhelming. Yeah. Yeah.
So I wonder what's going to happen there.
Yeah. It's a good question. And I don't know. I mean, that is really where companies engaged in using open source, and we touched upon this, in a variety of our talks. That is really the part that needs to be figured out. And I think, in some areas, what I'm seeing is companies now have the opportunity to evaluate the software that they're using. And the benefit of open source is the fact that you have the ability to make modifications to that software to fit your needs very specifically. But when you're pulling in a piece of software that pulls in many other dependencies that you aren't necessarily touching, I know that companies are looking much more closely at how can I get that software and have it maintained in a way so that I know that I'm current on my versions. I know I don't have any vulnerabilities in those, at least none that are recognized by the projects themselves. And so I am in the most recent version, so I can go to a commercial supplier, be it a distribution provider or other organizations that are starting to come up in the industry, to be able to provide support like that. And I know that it's another opportunity, and it's one that's being pursued by a lot of users of open source.
I mean, hopefully this will, give a boost to the startup companies in the open source ecosystem. It would be nice to see. I know that when there's a new project popping up that becomes popular, that obviously creates a lot of little startups around it. But it would be nice to see for these startups, more of them to make it, and also maybe not just form around the larger projects, but also all those dependencies that you're bringing in. Like, I think it would be a good way to kind of bring in money into the open source ecosystem in a way that is sustainable.
And it's one of aggregation, right? I mean, these commercial entities are working with the upstream projects, and ultimately that's where the funding needs to go, because those are the individuals that are actually putting those new versions out that make sure that when vulnerabilities are posted against their code base, the fixes do go in and new versions do get released. But you can't, because there are hundreds of thousands of these, in any given domain. Trying to do that as individuals is just, it's a non-starter from an administrative standpoint. So having this level of aggregation, and like I said, a big key there is that you're not modifying the software, because nobody wants to modify software that you've modified, or support software that you've modified. It's difficult, because they lose control over their own quality. But when that's not the case, a commercial entity, again, like these aggregators, I think it's a reasonable solution to put money into the ecosystem.